A young woman was walking through the forest when she was surrounded by 4 drunken majors, the Russian slang for the pampered, arrogant children of wealthy or influential parents. The girl, an 18-year-old named Nadia, was returning from the woods with a basket of strawberries, and her ethereal beauty attracted the attention of the golden youth. This story was told to me by an old hunter from a neighboring village, the narrator says. He was a witness to events that shocked the entire region and changed the life of the remote settlement forever. Even now, when the old man recalls that night, his hands tremble and his voice drops to a whisper. On that summer day, 4 sons of high-ranking officials came to the area to have fun. They were a typical group of golden youth who didn't know the value of money. They set up camp deep in the taiga, far from prying eyes, with expensive jeeps, weapons, and cases of elite French cognac and Scotch whiskey. Loud music blared, empty bottles were tossed into the bushes, and profanity filled the air. By noon, all 4 were thoroughly drunk and looking for new entertainment. They shot at empty cans until they got bored, then at a squirrel and some birds just for the thrill. They didn't need the meat. They only craved the excitement of the kill. Nadia walked along the path with her basket, humming quietly. Her long, light brown hair flowed in the wind. Her simple chintz dress highlighted her slender figure. She had an unusual, wild, natural beauty, the kind you only find in remote places far from the city. Her skin was like porcelain, and her huge green eyes reflected the entire forest. The majors saw her and were stunned. They hadn't seen such beauty even in the elite modeling agencies of the capital. Alcohol boiled in their blood, and the adrenaline from the recent shooting had not yet worn off. Where did such a beauty come from? The leader of the group slurred, blocking the path with a shiny SUV. I'm going home, Nadia replied softly, trying to walk around the car. Wait, beautiful, another one shouted, jumping out of the car with a bottle of expensive cognac in his hand. Let's get to know each other better. We'll show you how the real elite lives. They surrounded her in a tight circle. They were 4 men, about 20 to 22 years old, all alike in their arrogance. They wore expensive branded clothes, thick gold chains, and watches that cost as much as a good apartment. They had the arrogant smiles of people who had never been denied anything. Please move aside, the girl asked, but her words only incited the majors. What's the rush, beautiful? One of them guffawed. Maybe we'll take a ride with us? We have some entertainment from the capital for you. The leader reached for her hand with his dirty, alcohol-stained fingers. Nadia recoiled, and her basket fell. The ripe berries scattered across the ground like red drops. Don't, she said. The inner strength in her voice made the men falter for a second. But the alcohol, drugs, and ingrained sense of permissiveness quickly overcame any remnants of humanity. Look how proud she is. One of the majors laughed, grabbing her wrist. Do you know who we are? Our families hold half the country in their pocket. One phone call, and your entire village will be privatized. Suddenly, an old man emerged from the forest, leaning on a double-barreled shotgun instead of a stick. Grandfather Yakov appeared silently, like a forest shadow. The 70-year-old forester, who had lived his whole life in the taiga, had an amazing ability to walk quietly, to blend in with nature. He was tall and sinewy, with a gray beard and penetrating gray eyes. But now he stood in the middle of the road, emanating such cold fury that even the drunk majors froze. Move along, old man. The leader tried to maintain his arrogance. We're just getting to know the girl. Yakov silently approached his granddaughter, carefully freeing her hand from the major's dirty fingers. Nadia, go home, he said quietly, but his voice was filled with an unyielding will. Hey, old man, the most arrogant one yelled. We haven't properly introduced ourselves to the little one yet. The forester turned to him. Something ancient and terrifying flashed in his eyes, something that made the young man's throat go dry, as if he had looked into an abyss. "Get out of here," the old man said softly, but each word landed like a hammer blow. These simple words carried such a threat that the majors involuntarily backed away. Something primal and animalistic in the forester's voice made them remember that they were in a foreign world where their money and connections meant nothing. They reluctantly got into their jeeps, but the leader, already starting the engine, leaned out the window. "We'll see each other again, little one." The cars roared away, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of exhaust fumes mixed with the scent of alcohol. Nadia picked up the scattered berries. Her grandfather helped her. They walked home silently along the forest path. "Grandfather," the girl said, once they were hidden under the crowns of the ancient pines, "they will come back." "I know," Yakov replied. There was such certainty in his voice that it was clear he had already made up his mind and would be ready. He didn't tell her the most important thing then. He didn't tell her that he had already heard a distant howl coming from the depths of the taiga. The wolf pack was gathering at the call. An ancient debt, made 20 years ago, required fulfillment. To understand what happened next, one must be told a story that happened 20 years ago. At that time, a young forester named Yakov stumbled upon a scene in the most remote corner of the taiga that turned his whole life upside down. It was late autumn. The first frosts had covered the puddles with a thin crust of ice. Yakov was patrolling the remote hunting grounds, checking for snares set by poachers for fur animals, and he found what he was looking for, but not where he expected. In a steel trap, a huge black she-wolf was struggling. The metal teeth had bitten so deeply into her hind leg that the bone was visible through the torn flesh. Blood seeped onto the yellowed grass, forming a dark stain. The animal was exhausted from the hours-long struggle, but a hatred for humans still burned in her yellow eyes. The she-wolf tried to bite anything that came near, snarling from pain and helpless rage. Anyone else would have passed by or shot the wounded animal out of pity. It would have been easier and safer. But Yakov noticed the one thing that changed everything. The she-wolf was pregnant. Her belly was rounded, and under the exhausted skin, the future cubs, struggling for life, were clearly moving. Something stirred in the young forester's heart. Maybe it was the memory of his recently deceased wife. Or maybe it was just that rare humanity that so little of remains in our cruel world. He knew it was mortally dangerous. A wounded animal is unpredictable, and a she-wolf with cubs is the embodiment of maternal fury. But something made him act against common sense. Yakov cautiously approached the trap, speaking quietly and gently, as if to a frightened child. The she-wolf bared her teeth and snarled but couldn't get up. She had lost too much blood. Yakov slowly unclasped the steel jaws, freeing the mangled paw. The she-wolf tried to bite her savior, but she no longer had the strength. She could only snap her teeth in the air. Carrying 60 kilograms of living weight through the entire forest was not easy even for a young man. But Yakov took the she-wolf in his arms and carried her to his house. Each step was difficult. His back ached, his hands went numb, but he didn't stop. In the barn, he set up a lair for her with old blankets, washed the wound with warm water, treated it with iodine, and applied a homemade splint. He brought her a bowl of clean water and placed a piece of meat nearby. The she-wolf drank greedily but didn't take her eyes off the man. A look of surprise and disbelief was in them. For the first time in her life, a biped had not harmed her. On the contrary, he had helped her, fed her, and given her shelter. Yakov didn't sleep the first night, sitting next to the wounded animal. He was afraid the she-wolf would die from a pain-induced shock or blood poisoning. But in the morning, she was alive and even tried to get up on her paws. The following weeks were a test for both of them. Yakov fed the she-wolf, changed her bandages, and spoke quietly. Gradually, the mistrust in her yellow eyes was replaced by something resembling gratitude. She stopped snarling when he approached, allowed him to examine the wound, and even licked his hand. There was so much dog-like gratitude in the movement of her pink tongue that tears came to the harsh forester's eyes. A month later, the she-wolf gave birth to 5 cubs. The birth was difficult due to her exhausted state. Yakov helped as best he could, accepting the cubs, rubbing them with a dry cloth, and making sure they all got enough milk. He even gave the mother a name, Blackie, for the color of her jet-black fur. He simply named the cubs by the order of their birth: first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. When the cubs grew up, became stronger, and stood on their paws, the time came for them to part. Yakov opened the barn door wide and stepped aside. Freedom, that's what wild animals need more than anything in the world. Blackie looked at the man who had saved her and her children for a long time. She gathered the cubs with a soft growl and disappeared into the forest thicket. Yakov stood by the empty barn for a long time, feeling a strange emptiness in his chest. He had grown accustomed to this wolf family and had loved each cub. A year later, Blackie returned. She led her now-grown cubs to the house, sat on a distant hill, and howled. Not a mournful, animal-like howl, but an almost human, solemn one. Yakov understood without words. She was saying goodbye, thanking him, showing her offspring to the one who had given them life. Since then, a special bond had been established between the forester and the wolf pack. The animals never came close to the house, but Yakov constantly felt their invisible presence in the forest. They guarded this man and his family, and he didn't touch their territory or allow others to hunt in their domain. Wolves remember kindness longer than people and repay debts in full when the time comes. Reason refuses to believe in such a thing. It's too much like a fairy tale. But the heart understands a simple truth. Nature lives by its own laws, and the most important of them is justice. When little Nadia, orphaned after a terrible car accident that killed her parents, came to live with her grandfather, she quickly understood that this forest was a special place. Here, laws operated that were completely incomprehensible to city dwellers. The girl was only 8 years old then. Thin and frightened, she lost her speech for several months after the funeral. The doctors spoke of psychological trauma and advised treatment at a special clinic. But Yakov made his own decision, leaving his granddaughter in the forest, away from the hustle and bustle of people, and he was not mistaken. Gradually, the girl began to talk. At first, she simply followed her grandfather along the forest paths, silently watching his work. Then she began to ask questions, first with gestures, then in a whisper, and finally in a normal voice. Nadia grew up wild and free, like a forest animal. She could spend hours wandering through the taiga, gathering medicinal herbs, and talking to squirrels and birds. By the time she was 16, it was clear the girl had inherited her grandfather's rare gift of understanding nature. But she did it even better than Yakov. Animals were literally drawn to Nadia, as if they felt something kindred in her. Foxes would come out onto the paths as she approached. Otters would play near her in the river. Deer would allow her to pet their muzzles. Even bears, when they met the girl in the forest, showed no aggression. On the contrary, they would move aside with a kind of respectful look, as if acknowledging her right to be in their domain. There's something special about her, the old women in the village would whisper. It's as if the forest itself talks to her. It was the truth. Nadia truly understood the secret language of nature. The rustling of leaves in the wind, the singing of birds at dawn, the cracking of branches under the paws of invisible animals. All of this formed a clear picture of a living world for her. She could predict rain a day before the first clouds appeared, knew where to find rare mushrooms, and sensed the approach of wild animals long before they appeared. Local hunters sometimes asked for her advice, where to set snares, when the migration of birds would begin. And the wolves? The wolves appeared near the forester's house more and more often. They didn't come close, keeping a respectful distance, but Yakov constantly felt their presence in the surrounding forest. Blackie had grown old and gray, but the pack was growing. Her children and grandchildren continued to live in the most remote corners of the taiga, far from human settlements. But the connection with the man who had once saved their mother was not broken. When Nadia turned 12, an incident occurred that finally cemented the alliance between the human family and the wolf pack. The girl got lost in the forest while picking mushrooms. She left in the morning on a familiar path but got carried away and somewhere took a wrong turn. By evening, she hadn't returned home. Yakov searched all the familiar places. The clearings where Nadia usually gathered berries, the streams where she loved to wash her face, the secluded spots where she often read books. No one. The girl had vanished into thin air. Night fell. The forester took a flashlight and a hunting knife and set out to search. He called his granddaughter's name, shone the light in all directions, and listened to every rustle. But the taiga was silent, keeping its secret. By morning, Yakov was on the verge of despair. He was about to call the rescue service to get the whole village involved. He was already mentally picturing crowds of people with dogs and helicopters searching the forest when he saw his granddaughter on the porch of their own house. Nadia was sitting on an old bench, hugging her knees. She was alive and unharmed, just very tired and hungry. There was an expression of profound surprise on her face. "Where were you?" her grandfather asked, barely holding back tears of relief. "I got lost," the girl simply replied. "I went very far into the deepest thicket, and then the wolves came and led me home." Yakov didn't believe it at first, thinking the girl was in shock and fantasizing from exhaustion. But Nadia told the story so calmly, in such detail, that his doubts were dispelled. A large black she-wolf found her in a deep ravine where the frightened girl was crying. The pack surrounded her, but they didn't touch her. On the contrary, they led her along barely visible paths through the entire taiga, right to the house. "She was kind," Nadia said, "and beautiful." Since then, the bond between the families had become even stronger. Nadia didn't just feel the presence of the wolves. She understood their signals, recognized their voices, and knew the habits of each member of the pack. And the wolves guarded the girl as one of their own. More than once, Yakov noticed gray shadows gliding through the forest parallel to the path when his granddaughter went far from home. An invisible escort followed her, ready to defend her at any moment. "This cannot be," common sense screamed. Wild predators are not capable of such affection for humans. But the heart knew the truth. Animals are capable of gratitude better than many people. And when it comes to protecting those they consider family, there is no force more terrifying than a wolf pack. Now, when the golden youth threatened Nadia, the ancient pact between man and beast came into effect. The wolves remembered who had saved their mother 20 years ago, and they were ready to defend his family at any cost. Justice has many faces, and it doesn't always come in a judge's robe. That evening, after the first encounter with the majors, the forester Yakov sat on his porch for a long time, unable to calm down. Nadia was preparing dinner in the kitchen, clinking dishes and humming quietly. But the old man couldn't get the arrogant faces of the rich boys out of his head. He had lived in the forest his whole life and had seen different kinds of people. He knew there was a category that didn't recognize any boundaries or prohibitions. Those who were used to taking whatever they wanted without asking permission. Their parents' money and connections opened any doors and bought any silence. And Nadia, her beauty was that rare, wild beauty you don't find among city girls. Her long, light brown hair was the color of ripe wheat, and her huge green eyes reflected the entire forest. Her porcelain skin had not a single blemish. But most importantly, she seemed to glow from within with a special energy, the very energy that animals feel and are drawn to as a source of warmth. People also couldn't remain indifferent to this light. Only while the animals came with goodness, some representatives of the human race brought evil with them. And Yakov knew the majors wouldn't stop. For them, Nadia had become a desired prize they absolutely had to get. The old hunter who told me this story lived in the neighboring house and saw Yakov leave for the forest that evening. He took a piece of fresh venison and headed deep into the taiga along a barely visible path. He walked for a long time, almost an hour. He passed by the swamps where frogs croaked, crossed a stream on a fallen tree, and climbed a hill covered with old pines. Finally, he reached a familiar clearing at the foot of a huge oak tree. This place was special. Here, according to the elders, his grandfather used to meet with forest spirits and ask for their protection for his family. Of course, there were no spirits. There were wolves. But did that change the essence of the matter? Yakov placed the meat on a mossy stone at the roots of the oak, sat down nearby, and waited. The forest around him lived its evening life. Owls hooted, mice rustled in the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a horned owl hooted. An hour passed. From the bushes, a she-wolf emerged slowly and cautiously. It was old Blackie, now completely gray but still strong and imposing. Behind her, several more gray shadows appeared, her adult children and grandchildren. The she-wolf approached the meat, sniffed it, but didn't eat. She raised her snout and looked at the man with yellow eyes that showed a complete understanding of the situation. "They will return," Yakov said quietly, as if talking to himself. "Those rich boys will want to harm my granddaughter. They won't give up until they get what they want." The she-wolf listened, tilting her head to the side. Her posture was tense. She was waiting to hear what else this man would say. "Will you help me?" Yakov continued. It wasn't a question. It was a statement based on 20 years of friendship and mutual respect. Blackie slowly nodded. She actually nodded in a way that was humanly understandable. Then she raised her snout to the starry sky and howled. It was a long, drawn-out sound, full of ancient power and a promise of revenge. She was answered from different parts of the forest. First one voice, then a second, a third, a fourth. It seemed the entire taiga was filled with a wolf howl. The forester turned and went home. With each step, his legs felt weak from the realization of what had just happened. A man and wild animals had made a pact, not in words, but in deeds. It was a pact sealed by mutual respect, gratitude, and a willingness to protect family. Everything inside him screamed, "This can't be. Such things only happen in fairy tales or movies." But he had seen with his own eyes how Blackie had nodded in agreement. He had heard the howl of the pack that had responded to the call of its matriarch. At home, Nadia had already set the table. There was borscht with meat, fresh bread, and cucumbers from their own garden, simple village food. "Grandfather, where did you go?" the girl asked, pouring tea into the mugs. "Just on some business," Yakov replied evasively. But Nadia was an unusual girl. She felt her grandfather's mood, saw the tension in his posture, and heard the notes of anxiety in his voice. "You saw the wolves?" she said, not asking, but stating a fact. Yakov looked up at her in surprise. "How do you know?" "I heard the howl. It was distant but familiar." Blackie was gathering the pack. "Maybe," her grandfather cautiously agreed. "They will come to protect us," Nadia continued with the same calm certainty. "If those bad people come back, the wolves will be ready." Yakov put down his spoon and looked at his granddaughter intently. "Aren't you afraid?" "No. Why should I be afraid of those who love us?" There was such natural wisdom in her words that the old man's heart ached. This girl understood the laws of nature better than many adults. "But what if it's scary?" he asked. "It won't be," Nadia replied confidently. "I know that whatever happens, they'll be there." They ate dinner in silence, each thinking their own thoughts. Outside the windows, darkness deepened, and somewhere deep in the forest, gray shadows roamed, preparing for the upcoming battle. Nature prepared to defend its children. The next day, the majors did return, but now there were more of them. 3 adult men joined the 4 golden boys. By the looks of it, they were bodyguards, the kind rich daddies hire. They arrived at noon when Yakov had gone to the village for groceries. Nadia was home alone, tidying up the garden, watering the cucumber and tomato beds, and preparing lunch on the old wood-burning stove. First, she heard the roar of the engines, then the music, the same awful rap as yesterday. Peeking out from behind the fence, the girl saw a sight that made her blood run cold. 7 men got out of 3 jeeps. They were all armed. Some had pistols tucked into their belts. The leader of the majors smirked, anticipating an easy victory over the defenseless girl. "Well, beautiful," he yelled when he saw Nadia. "Let's get to know each other." Nadia silently went into the house and bolted the door, but she knew the wooden door and old windows wouldn't stop 7 armed men. If they really decided to take her by force, there were no obstacles for them. The men began to surround the house, yelling obscenities and banging on the walls. One of them fired a shot in the air to intimidate her. The automatic burst echoed through the forest. "Come out, beautiful," the leader yelled. "We'll get you anyway, but if you resist, it will hurt more." "We're cultured people," another one laughed. "We don't want to break your little house. Come out nicely, or we'll start shooting at the windows." "We'll accidentally hit you," a third chimed in. "Then we'll be sorry." Nadia sat in the kitchen, listening to the distant sounds that these city dwellers couldn't distinguish. Somewhere deep in the taiga, a barely audible howl echoed, quiet, almost imperceptible, but she caught every note. The pack was answering Blackie's call. The old she-wolf was gathering her children and grandchildren. "Do you hear?" the girl whispered into the emptiness. "They're coming. They're close now." Meanwhile, the majors lost their patience. One of them broke a window with the butt of his rifle and started to climb into the house. 3 remained outside, and burst inside. They went through the entryway, looked in her grandfather's bedroom, and searched the storeroom. Finally, they found Nadia in the kitchen. The girl was standing by the window, looking toward the forest. "Here she is, our forest princess," the leader of the majors breathed, licking his lips. "Even more beautiful than yesterday." "Don't resist, little girl," one of the brutes said. "We want to have a good time." "She's not against a good time," another laughed. "Look how calmly she's standing. She's already in the mood for fun." Nadia slowly turned to them. Her beauty in that moment was astonishing. Her face was pale but completely calm. Her green eyes burned with an inner fire. She looked like an ancient goddess who knew the future. "You shouldn't have started this," she said quietly. But each word sounded with such power that the men froze for a second. "Oh yeah," the leader nervously laughed. "And what are you going to do to us, doll? Call your daddy or the police?" "Not me," the girl replied, not taking her eyes off the forest outside the window. "They will." "Who are they?" one of the bodyguards began to ask, but he didn't get to finish. The forest around the house seemed to explode with movement. From the darkness between the tree trunks, gray shadows slowly emerged. 1, a second, a third, a fourth. The wolves appeared from everywhere. From the bushes, from behind the trees. A young male even jumped down from the roof of the barn. The men outside screamed in horror and raised their rifles. But they didn't dare to shoot. There were too many animals and they had come too close. It seemed the entire forest had come to life and was moving in attack. "What the hell?" the leader of the majors cursed, looking out the broken window. There were more than 20 of them. A whole army of gray predators. Mature males with powerful jaws, young females as fast as lightning, and even teenagers who were just learning to hunt. All of them looked at the house with yellow, unblinking eyes, full of ancient hatred for human cruelty. At the front stood a huge black she-wolf. Old Blackie, now gray with scars on her face but still inspiring sacred terror. She looked at the people with such concentrated fury that their hearts stopped beating. In her gaze, there was the memory of hundreds of her relatives killed, of cubs shot for sport, of the centuries-old humiliations that humans had inflicted upon the wolf kind. The time for reckoning had come. Reason refused to believe what was happening, the narrator says. But our eyes saw the truth. Wild animals had come to enact justice on those who dared to threaten their human family. The Majors and their friends rushed around the house, not knowing what to do. Outside, they were surrounded by a wolf army, and there was no escape. The rifles in their hands trembled with fear. The ammunition could run out at any second. "Shoot them!" the leader hysterically screamed. "Kill those beasts, all of them. There are too many of them." One of the bodyguards, who had seen a lot in his life but had never encountered such a nightmare, croaked. "We won't have time to reload. They'll eat us alive." "What should we do then?" one of the Majors shrieked. "Call for help." "What help, you idiot?" the bodyguard snapped. "We're in the middle of the taiga. There's no signal. The nearest settlement is 100 kilometers away." Nadia stood by the broken window and looked at them with an expression of ancient sorrow, as if she saw not specific people, but symbols of human cruelty who would finally get what they deserved. "They are not just wolves," she said quietly. "This is a family. A large family that has been waiting for 20 years for a chance to repay kindness with kindness." "What kind of family, for God's sake?" the leader of the Majors howled. "They're wild animals. They should be afraid of us." "They should," Nadia agreed. "But they're no longer afraid because they've realized you're not people. You're worse than beasts." "Shut up, you fool." One of the Majors raised his hand to hit her but stopped, seeing what was happening outside. The wolves began to move slowly, methodically, without fuss. Part of the pack surrounded the house in a tight ring. Part of it headed for the cars to cut off any escape routes. They acted as a single organism, as if controlled by an invisible intelligence. Each one knew its role in the upcoming hunt, and this hunt was a special one, not for food, but for justice. "Maybe we can come to an agreement?" One of the bodyguards tried to maintain a semblance of composure. "We have money, a lot of money. We can pay for the girl." Nadia looked at him with surprise. "You think you can make a deal with them for money? They don't know what money is. They only know justice." "What justice?" the leader yelled. "We haven't done anything." "Not yet," the girl corrected him. "But you were going to, and the intention to do evil is already evil." One of the Majors couldn't handle the tension. He sharply turned his rifle toward the nearest wolf and pulled the trigger. The burst missed, his hands trembling with fear, but the wolves took it as a declaration of war. Blackie raised her snout to the sky and howled. It was a short, sharp sound, a command to attack. A sound the entire pack had been waiting for. What happened next is impossible to describe in human words. It was not just a massacre. It was an execution. It was brutal, ruthless, but completely just. The wolves attacked in sync like a well-oiled killing machine. The windows shattered under the blows of their powerful bodies. The door was torn from its hinges by the impact of 3 animals at once. Gray shadows burst into the house from all sides simultaneously. The men fired, but in their panic, they hit everything but their targets. Bullets flew into the ceiling, the walls, into the void, while the wolves attacked precisely, quickly, and lethally. They didn't growl or howl. They just did their job silently and professionally. The leader of the Majors tried to hide in a closet, but a young wolf dragged him out by the leg. The bodyguards tried to cover themselves with automatic fire, but their ammunition quickly ran out, and reloading in such a situation was impossible. Nadia slipped out of the house at the very beginning of the slaughter. The wolves parted before her, clearing the way. Old Blackie even nudged her palm with her snout, as if to say, "Get out of here. It's dangerous for people like you." The girl ran into the forest toward her grandfather's house. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like it would jump out of her chest. Behind her, the screams, gunshots, and sounds of struggle gradually subsided. Then a deathly silence fell. When Yakov returned an hour later with a bag of groceries over his shoulder, he found his granddaughter sitting on the porch, pale but alive and unharmed. "What happened?" he asked, though he had already understood from the sounds he heard from afar. The pack had fulfilled its promise. They came, Nadia said quietly. 7 men wanted to hurt me, but the wolves protected me. Yakov hugged his granddaughter, holding her tightly. His hands trembled with both relief and horror. Relief that the girl was alive, and horror at the realization of what was happening inside the ransacked house. Everything inside him screamed that this couldn't have happened in real life. Such things only happen in nightmares or horror movies. But his heart knew the truth. Nature had repaid kindness with kindness and punished evil in the most ancient way. Justice had prevailed. But at what cost? The next morning, investigators arrived at the ransacked house. They were called by the parents of the Majors, who had been calling their golden boys all night but couldn't reach them. The scene that greeted the arriving detectives shocked even the most experienced of them. 7 corpses were scattered throughout the ransacked house and the surrounding area. Twisted rifles, smashed jeeps, and dried blood everywhere. One of the SUVs had, in some incredible way, ended up on the roof of the barn. It was impossible to understand how a 3-ton car had been thrown there. The metal was so dented it looked as if a giant press had gone over it. A second jeep was hanging from an old pine tree 20 meters from the house. The tree had pierced the cabin like a giant spear. The driver's seat was torn to shreds. The third car lay on its side in a ravine, wheels up. All the windows were smashed, and the body was covered in deep scratches that only very large claws could have left. As for the bodies, what was left of the 7 men was difficult not only to identify but even to count. The local precinct officer, who had seen everything in his service, spent 2 hours throwing up in the bushes. A detective refused to inspect the scene without a bulletproof vest and a gas mask. Wild animals, stated a criminal expert who had arrived from the regional center. An attack by a large pack of hungry predators. But many details bothered the experienced detective. The attack was too purposeful, the equipment was destroyed too methodically. It was as if the animals were acting not on instinct but on a pre-planned strategy. Most importantly, not a single body had been eaten. Ordinary hungry wolves would have torn the pieces of meat and carried them into the forest, feasting on them. But here, the bodies were simply torn apart and left as they were. This was revenge, the expert concluded. Pure, cold revenge for something very personal. A forensic expert, who arrived by helicopter from the capital, confirmed the preliminary findings. All wounds were inflicted by the fangs and claws of large predators. The tooth marks indicated there were at least 20 attackers. Anomalous phenomenon, zoologists from the university said, shrugging their shoulders. Apparently, a prolonged drought forced wolves from different areas to unite into a super pack for a joint hunt. But why did they attack people? The scientists wondered. Wolves usually avoid contact with humans. Hunger, the lead expert explained. There was little game in the forest, so the predators switched to easier prey. The version was officially accepted, although many details didn't fit, but no other explanation could be found. The news of the deaths of 7 people, among whom were 4 heirs to the country's most influential families, instantly spread through all media channels. Television crews came in droves to the remote village, filming stories against the backdrop of the ransacked house, interviewing local residents, and building theories about an invasion of bloodthirsty beasts. Environmental disaster, experts screamed from the screens. Climate change has led to a disruption of food chains. Wild animals are losing their fear of humans. Urgent measures must be taken, lawmakers demanded. We need to shoot the predators before they turn the entire taiga into a death zone. But the parents of the deceased majors demanded a different investigation. They didn't believe the wild animal version and hired private detectives, experts, and even psychics. Our children were killed. The mother of one of the majors sobbed on television. Wolves couldn't have done this. This was a planned murder. We will find the culprits. The father of another swore. We'll spend any amount of money, but the truth will come out. But the facts were stubborn. No traces of human presence were found at the scene of the tragedy. The weapons lay unused. The rifles were full of ammunition. This meant the shooting was chaotic and done in a panic. The examination showed the victims tried to hide in the house, but the predators broke through all the obstacles. The nature of the wounds indicated that death came quickly. The animals killed professionally without tormenting their prey. A tragic accident, the State Commission ruled. An attack by a pack of hungry wolves on a group of people who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. The case was officially closed a month later. The parents of the deceased were quietly asked not to make a fuss. The image of the country suffers from such sensational stories. The media published articles about how important it is to observe safety precautions when visiting wild places. Experts gave advice to tourists on how to behave when encountering predators. And 6 months later, the story was almost forgotten. New scandals and new tragedies overshadowed the memory of the 7 corpses in the remote taiga. But in our village, everyone knew the truth and remained silent. Who would believe such a story? And why tell it? Justice had been served. The wolves had fulfilled their duty. After that bloody night, our region seemed to be reborn. The changes were not felt immediately, but gradually it became clear that something had fundamentally changed in the relationship between people and wild nature. No more golden youth came to the remote places to have fun. The information about what had happened to their predecessors had somehow spread through all the right circles. And the rich boys learned a simple truth. There are places on Earth where their money and connections are absolutely powerless. The few who still dared to appear in our area behaved completely differently. There were no drunken parties, no shooting at animals, no attempts to bother local girls. They would come quietly, rest modestly, and leave without saying goodbye. Poaching in the region practically disappeared. Even the most desperate hunters for easy profit preferred to look for game in other regions. Rumors of a giant wolf pack that methodically annihilated 7 armed men were more effective than any fines or arrests. Local hooligans also quieted down, as if they felt someone was watching over the forest, someone very strong and just. And this someone would not tolerate the violation of the ancient laws of harmony. Nature seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. There were noticeably more animals. The birds sang louder. Even the plants reached for the sun with new vigor. And Nadia? Nadia blossomed like never before after those events. She enrolled in a pedagogical institute in the regional center and threw herself into her studies. Biology, zoology, ecology, botany, all subjects related to the study of living nature came to her easily and naturally. Her teachers were surprised by her deep knowledge. The girl could talk for hours about the habits of animals, the connections in ecosystems, and the subtle mechanisms of natural balance. Where does she get such erudition? The professors wondered. It was as if she hadn't studied nature from books but had lived with it side by side her whole life. And that was the truth. Nadia had indeed grown up in the forest, absorbed its wisdom with her mother's milk, and learned to understand the language of animals and birds before she mastered human literacy. Her student years flew by quickly. She graduated with honors, received recommendations for postgraduate studies, and was offered jobs at scientific institutes in the capital. But Nadia chose a different path. She returned to her native village and became a biology teacher at the district school. The salary was ridiculous, the conditions were Spartan, and the career prospects were zero. But the girl was happy. "This is where I belong," she explained to those who were surprised by her choice. "Here, I can do some real good." And she truly did. The children adored her. Their parents were grateful, and her colleagues respected her. Nadia had a special gift. She could explain the most complex things in simple words, make people love nature, and make them want to protect it. Most importantly, she created a unique club of young ecologists at the school. The children studied the nature of their native region, learned to protect the forest, and helped animals in trouble. On weekends, Nadia would take her students on hikes. It was an amazing sight. 20 children would follow their young teacher, not making any noise, not misbehaving, listening carefully to her every word. And all around them, there was complete harmony with nature. Birds did not fly away at their approach. Squirrels came down from the trees. Foxes would come out onto the paths and watch the people with indifference. "How do you do it?" her colleagues asked. "I don't," Nadia replied. "The children just feel that I love the forest, and the forest returns our affection." Her articles on environmental education were published in regional and even capital publications. People came from neighboring districts and regions to attend her lectures. They felt that this was not just a teacher but someone who truly understood the deep secrets of nature. "Man and nature must live in harmony," she told her students and listeners. "We are not the owners of the forest. We are its guests, and we must behave accordingly, with respect and gratitude." For some reason, these simple words resonated in the hearts of very different people. Businessmen revised their plans for building in protected areas. Hunters set snares more humanely. Tourists stopped leaving trash in the forest. Yakov rejoiced in his granddaughter's success, but his health had noticeably deteriorated. 75 years of hard physical labor, his whole life and constant worries. All of it had taken its toll. His gray hair had turned completely white. His back was stooped, and his hands had begun to tremble. In the mornings, the old man had trouble getting out of bed, and in the evenings, he would fall asleep right at the table over his unfinished tea. "Don't worry, grandfather," Nadia would comfort him when she came for the weekend. "You did your part. You taught me to love the forest and understand its laws. Now I'll pass that knowledge on to the children, and they'll pass it on to their children." The old man would smile and stroke her head, just as he had when she was a little girl. In his faded eyes, there was pride and a deep sense of peace. He knew the work of his entire life would be continued in worthy hands. "What about the wolves?" Nadia would sometimes ask. "Do you see them?" "Sometimes," Yakov would reply. "Less often than before. They've grown old just like me. But I know they're somewhere nearby." Indeed, amazing changes continued to occur in the forest. Trees grew faster than usual. The grass became emerald green, and the flowers smelled brighter. Even the climate seemed to have softened. Winters became warmer, summers more rainy, and autumns longer. Scientists from the university came to study this phenomenon, measuring soil acidity, analyzing air composition, and counting the number of animal and plant species. "A unique ecosystem," the professors said, throwing up their hands. "Here, the natural balance that has been irreversibly lost in other places has been preserved." They built complex theories about the influence of solar activity, climatic cycles, and the natural processes of restoring ecological balance. But they couldn't fully explain what was happening. The local residents, however, knew a simple truth. The forest came back to life after justice was restored. Nature once again trusted people because evil had received its just retribution. Hunters told strange stories about encounters in the most remote corners of the taiga, as if they had seen the tracks of huge wolf paws and heard howls that made their blood run cold. It was as if a legendary pack still lived somewhere in the impenetrable thickets. "A pack of avengers," the old people whispered. "It only appears when the forest is in real trouble." But these were just beautiful legends passed down from mouth to mouth during long winter evenings. The truth was something else. An ancient balance of mutual respect and understanding had been restored between man and nature. Meanwhile, Nadia's personal life had settled down. She married Mikhail, a young forester from a neighboring district who was as much in love with nature as she was. He came from a simple family, without a lot of money or connections, but with a kind heart and golden hands. The wedding was modest, following village customs. But an amazing thing happened. On the day of the celebration, there was an unusual silence in the forest, as if all the animals and birds had frozen, blessing the union of two people who had dedicated their lives to protecting nature. And as the newlyweds walked from the church to the house, a familiar gray shadow appeared at the edge of the clearing. Old Blackie, even grayer now but still proud, was watching her human daughter find happiness. The she-wolf stood for a few seconds as if giving her blessing, then dissolved into the forest thicket. But everyone present understood that nature approved of this marriage. A year later, Nadia and Mikhail had twins, a boy and a girl. The children turned out to be amazing. From their first months of life, they showed an unusual connection with nature. The babies never cried when they were taken into the forest. On the contrary, they would calm down, reach out their hands to the trees, and babble in their own infant language. Birds would land on their stroller, and squirrels would come down from the trees to look at the human cubs. "They will be special," Yakov would say, rocking his grandchildren in his arms. "The blood of those who understand the forest flows in them." The old man was right. As they grew older, the twins became more and more like their mother. Little Anechka could sit still for hours watching ants or caterpillars. Petya talked to cats and dogs, and they seemed to understand him. By the age of 3, the children could navigate the forest freely, knew edible berries, and could find springs with clean water. They never got lost, were not afraid of wild animals, and did not break branches unnecessarily. "Mom, why is the wolf sad?" Anechka once asked, pointing toward the bushes. Nadia looked closely and indeed saw a gray snout watching them from a safe distance. It was one of Blackie's descendants, an old male with intelligent eyes. "He's not sad, my daughter," her mother explained. "He's just old and wise. He's watching new people grow who will protect his home." The wolf seemed to understand her words, slowly nodded, and disappeared into the thicket. Yakov lived to see his great-grandchildren's 4th birthday. On that day, he gathered the whole family on the porch of his house and looked at the children, his granddaughter and her husband for a long time. "It is good," he finally said. "The family continues. The forest will be protected." That night, the old forester died quietly in his sleep, without suffering, without illness. He simply let his soul go when he realized that his mission was complete. Yakov was buried by the entire village and neighboring settlements. The coffin was carried by hand from the house to the cemetery, and a priest walked at the head of the procession with an icon and a censer. But the most amazing thing happened when the funeral procession left the village. All along the road to the cemetery, forest animals stood. Deer, moose, wild boars, bears, foxes, and hares. All of them had come out of the thicket and stood still in a respectful silence. Even the birds stopped singing. Only the wind rustled in the crowns of the ancient pines. The animals were seeing off a man who had protected them his whole life. They stood motionless until the coffin was lowered into the ground and the priest had read the final prayer. And when the first handful of soil fell on the lid of the coffin, a long howl came from the forest. The wolf pack was saying goodbye to its friend in its own ancient, wild way. Everyone present felt that an era was ending, the era of people who understood the language of nature and lived by its laws. But Nadia remained, and her children remained. The line of forest guardians continued. The girl turned her grandfather's house into a small museum of the nature of her native land. School children from different districts, biology students, and just nature lovers came there. Nadia told them about the forest, the animals, and how important it is to live in harmony with the world around us. She showed them herbaria of rare plants, photos of birds and animals, and maps of ecological trails. But the main story, the story of that bloody night 7 years ago, she told very rarely, and only to those she felt were capable of believing the impossible. "Nature remembers everything," she would tell such select visitors. "It remembers everyone who came to it with kindness and everyone who brought evil. Sooner or later, it gives everyone what they deserve." The forest continued to live its mysterious life. No one saw the wolves anymore, but their presence was constantly felt. Sometimes huge tracks were found on the forest paths. Sometimes a distant howl was heard on moonless nights. The majors never came to our region again. Not just the golden youth, but no one who could harm nature. The information about the fate of the 7 armed men spread through all the right circles. And everyone understood that there are places on Earth where laws more ancient and just than human ones are in effect. Places where evil inevitably gets its retribution. Now, as I tell this incredible story, I sometimes don't believe that it's absolutely true. Reason protests against such fantastic coincidences. Logic demands a rational explanation. But my heart knows that it all happened exactly as that old hunter told me. He didn't know how to make things up. He didn't know what fiction was. He only told me what he had seen with his own eyes. And he had seen a miracle, an ancient, wild miracle of justice that most modern people consider impossible. 7 years have passed since that fateful day. Nadia has become a well-known ecologist, the author of several books on nature, and a winner of regional awards for her contribution to environmental protection. Her children have grown up and gone to school. Anechka and Pedia are good students, especially in biology and geography. In their free time, they help their mother at the museum and give tours for younger students. Mom, is it true that grandfather Yakov talked to wolves? They sometimes ask. It's true, Nadia replies. He understood their language and they understood his. And can we learn? You can, if you love the forest as much as he did. The children believe their mother unconditionally and are already showing amazing abilities. They can predict the weather, find lost animals, and comfort wounded birds. Mikhail is the chief forester of the district. Under his leadership, the area of protected zones has tripled. Poaching has practically disappeared. The populations of rare animals are recovering. We have a special forest, he tells his colleagues. Here, nature protects itself. Our task is just to not get in its way. And indeed, the changes in the local ecosystem amaze even scientists. Species diversity grows every year. Animals that haven't been seen for decades are returning. Even the climate has become milder and more favorable. It's a phenomenon, researchers say, throwing up their hands. It's as if time here has turned back to the state of nature it was in 100 years ago. They don't know the most important thing. The balance between man and wild nature has been restored here, a balance that our ancestors considered natural but which we have almost lost. What about the wolves? No one sees them anymore, but their tracks are sometimes found, huge paw prints on the forest paths, droppings the size of a dog's head, and claw marks on the bark of ancient pines. It is said that somewhere in the deepest thickets of the taiga, the last pack of Blackie's descendants lives. Old wolves who remember that night of revenge, and young ones who have been passed down the story of the people who deserve their protection. They appear rarely, only when the forest is in serious danger. But their mere presence is enough to make any enemies of nature prefer to bypass these places. Local residents treat the wolves with a mixture of respectful fear and gratitude. They understand that guardians live nearby who will not allow harm to come to people, animals, or trees. They are our protectors, the old people tell the young. As long as the wolves are in the forest, we can sleep peacefully. And they do sleep peacefully. In these parts, there are no crimes against nature. There are no forest fires caused by humans. No cases of poaching or illegal logging. It's as if an invisible guard watches over everyone who enters the forest. And woe to anyone who comes here with bad intentions. The story I've told has changed my life. Now, I look at nature, animals, and the relationship between humans and the world around us in a completely different way. I understand that we are not alone on this planet. Next to us live creatures who remember good and evil, who are capable of gratitude and revenge, of love and hatred. And most importantly, they keep their own account of human actions, noting every act of cruelty and every act of mercy. And when the scales tip in one direction, nature restores the balance using its own methods. Yakov once saved a dying she-wolf from a poacher's trap. He nursed her, helped her give birth to her cubs, and set her free. 20 years later, That she-wolf and her offspring saved his granddaughter from disgrace and death. 7 armed men, accustomed to impunity, were taught a lesson in justice by those they considered to be dumb beasts. Nature showed that it remembers everything and, sooner or later, gives everyone what they deserve. This is not a fairy tale or a made-up story. This is the truth about how the world is really structured. It is the truth about laws that were in effect long before human courts came into being and will continue to operate when our civilization has turned to dust. Wild animals remember kindness longer than people and pay for it with protection, loyalty, and a willingness to give their lives for those they consider family. But they also remember evil. And when their patience runs out, nature delivers its judgment, which is ruthless but just. Nature always repays its debts. Always.